a decorated U.S. Army general, a routine traffic stop, and one smirking officer who had no idea who he was messing with. What happens when power is abused and the wrong man gets targeted? This isn't just another viral video. It's a masterclass in justice, dignity, and one phone call that flipped the entire system upside down. Stay to the end, because what starts as humiliation on the roadside becomes a courtroom reckoning that stuns everyone watching. If you're here for real-life stories where the tables turn hard and fast, hit that subscribe button now, and let's dive into the story the system tried to ignore. It started on a quiet morning stretch of Highway 31, deep in southern Alabama. The sky was pale blue, the trees still heavy with summer green. A black luxury SUV cruised steadily along the right lane, obeying every speed limit, every signal. Inside, General Lionel Hart, retired U.S. Army general and once one of the highest-ranking black officers in military history, was en route to speak at a veterans symposium in Montgomery. With decades of decorated service, Lionel had long learned how to carry himself with dignity, especially in uniform. Today he wore civilian clothes, a beige blazer, crisp slacks, and a lapel pin bearing the Army crest. But to the patrol cruiser that began tailing him, none of that mattered. To Officer Trent Mallory, Lionel was just another black man behind the wheel of a nice vehicle. Within minutes, the siren lit up. General Hart pulled over calmly, hands visible on the wheel. What followed was a textbook example of racial profiling. Mallory approached aggressively, demanded ID without cause, claimed the SUV was possibly stolen, and ignored Lionel's calm explanation. When Hart attempted to retrieve his vehicle registration from the glove box, Mallory placed a hand on his weapon. "Step out of the car," Mallory barked. Lionel's age, the calm timbre of his voice, his request to know the probable cause, none of it deterred the officer. A few minutes later, Officer Keller began searching the vehicle without consent. General Hart stood by the roadside, insulted, humiliated, and unlawfully detained. What Mallory didn't realize was who he had just targeted and who Lionel Hart had on speed dial. The incident would escalate not just into a civil rights lawsuit, but a national media storm, a courtroom reckoning, and a brutal lesson in institutional accountability. Because this wasn't just any man Mallory stopped. And by the time he laughed in court, mocking Lionel's calm demeanor, one phone call would be all it took to flip the power dynamic upside down. The question wasn't whether the stop was legal. It wasn't even whether Mallory and Keller were racist. The real question was, what happens when the law finally has to answer to someone who spent his life upholding it? When the flashing blue lights lit up Lionel Hart's rearview mirror. He'd just passed a faded gas station off exit 118, the same place he'd stopped years ago during a convoy tour. It looked the same. Old signage, a chipped red awning. But the context today couldn't have felt more different. He sighed quietly, pulling over to the gravel shoulder and putting the SUV in park. His hands stayed high on the wheel, his breathing even, just like he had instructed hundreds of young soldiers before. Comply first, ask later. Officer Trent Mallory swaggered to the driver's window with an air of prejudgment so thick you could smell it. Behind his aviator sunglasses, his eyes scanned Lionel's face, his clothes, the clean dashboard. "License and registration," he barked. Lionel gave a polite nod and gestured toward the glove compartment. "I'll need to reach—" Slowly, Mallory snapped, his hand hovering over his holster. From the passenger mirror, Lionel noticed the second officer, Dwayne Keller, now approaching the opposite side. "Sir, are you aware your plates don't match the registered VIN?" Keller asked, less aggressive, but clearly reading from a rehearsed script. "That's inaccurate," Lionel replied, voice calm. "This vehicle was issued to me directly. The plates are updated and the VIN is registered to the U.S. Army Liaison Fleet." Mallory's brow furrowed. "Fleet?" "I'm retired military. This was provided as a courtesy for my trip to Montgomery." "You got ID to prove that?" Mallory asked, his tone already skeptical. Lionel passed over his license and his retired military identification card. Mallory held it up like he was examining a counterfeit bill. "Looks fancy," he sneered. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for me, sir?" "Under what grounds?" Lionel asked. "Suspicion of stolen property and possible vehicle fraud." Lionel's jaw set slightly. "You haven't run my ID yet," Mallory smirked. "Don't need to. Gut says something's off." Lionel opened the door and stepped out slowly. He wasn't going to escalate. Not now. He placed both hands on the hood as instructed. Keller began opening the rear door. "You don't have consent to search my vehicle," Lionel reminded him. Mallory turned toward Keller. "We've got verbal probable cause, nervous behavior." "I'm not nervous," Lionel said flatly. "I'm controlled. There's a difference." But they weren't listening. The search went on, bags unzipped, papers rifled through. Keller paused at a closed leather portfolio, flipping it open to find an itinerary, handwritten notes, and a guest list for the symposium. At the top, General Lionel Hart, keynote speaker. "Hey, Trent," Keller muttered. Mallory glanced back, annoyed. "What?" Keller turned the portfolio toward him. Mallory's expression faltered for a millisecond, but he covered it with a scoff. "Doesn't prove anything." At that moment, Lionel reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a phone. One quick tap, and he held it up to his ear. "Sir, I said no phone calls," Mallory barked. Lionel ignored him. "Thomas, it's Lionel. Yes, we have a situation. Highway 31, mile marker 64. Mallory snatched the phone from his hand and ended the call. "That's it," he said. "You're resisting." "I'm documenting," Lionel corrected. What Mallory didn't know was who Thomas was. Major Thomas Reed, special counsel at the Pentagon. Within 15 minutes, the local sheriff's line rang off the hook. 10 minutes after that, Alabama. State Command called for an internal suspension pending investigation. But the real consequences wouldn't arrive until court. Because the man they laughed at today, he had trained people who now outranked every badge in that precinct. And soon, every officer in the state would know the name Lionel Hart. Mallory returned to his cruiser smug, but Keller glanced back once more. He wasn't so sure. There was something about Lionel's voice, that calm clarity that didn't beg for understanding. It demanded it. The moment passed, but the impact didn't. Across the county, a dispatcher was patching in a call to Montgomery. At Fort Morris, a colonel sat upright at his desk as the situation report landed on his terminal. General Hart had been stopped. No charges, no weapons, no contraband. Just dignity violated. And that was enough. That night, Lionel sat at his hotel desk, writing in a leather-bound journal. He wrote not about anger, but precision. What time the stop began, how Mallory's hand hovered over the weapon, the wording of each false accusation. The page ended with a name and badge number, underlined, Mallory. Then one word, circled, pattern. He was not just building a case, he was writing the beginning of their undoing. The next morning, General Hart walked into a quiet Pentagon office suite dressed in a charcoal gray suit. Major Thomas Reed stood waiting near the window, a man whose stern face rarely showed surprise, until now. "Lionel," he said, voice tight with restrained anger, "we've got a situation on our hands." Lionel handed over a slim folder. Inside was a handwritten transcript of the stop, dates, badge numbers, and a printed itinerary with his military ID attached. Reed didn't need to read far. "They have no idea what they've done," he muttered. "No," Lionel replied quietly, "but they will." Reed picked up his desk phone and began making calls. Within an hour, 3 major federal departments had been looped in. By noon, a preliminary civil rights complaint had been submitted to the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division, and by evening, A press statement from the Army's Public Affairs Office condemned the unwarranted and dehumanizing treatment of a retired general. But that was only the beginning. Lionel knew the courtroom was where change took root. The case made headlines quickly. Retired Army general profiled in Alabama traffic stop, blared across local news tickers. National outlets followed. CNN reached out. So did MSNBC, but Lionel declined every interview. He wasn't chasing outrage. He was preparing for war. 2 weeks later, in a packed courthouse in Birmingham, the lawsuit was officially filed. Unlawful search and seizure, racial profiling, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Mallory and Keller were named directly, along with the Alabama Highway Patrol Division. The footage from Lionel's dash cam, which had silently recorded every second, was turned over to the court. So was his call log, showing a live call to Major Reed during the stop. It hit like a thunderclap. Officer Mallory's smirk at the first hearing didn't last long. When the judge announced that Lionel Hart had once served on the Pentagon's Military Justice Reform Board and had personally drafted several compliance policies used nationwide, even the defense attorney raised an eyebrow. Mallory whispered something to his lawyer. Keller just stared at the desk. During a recess, Lionel walked the hallway quietly. Reporters surrounded him, but he raised a hand. "I'll speak when it matters," he said. "Not before." Back in session, Major Reed testified via video link. He spoke in clipped military cadence, confirming Lionel's assignment, the vehicle's registration, and most crucially, his status. "General Hart is not only a decorated officer," he said, "but a man who spent his career training law enforcement and military police on de-escalation and civilian rights." When Judge Irene Wallace glanced at the file in front of her, thick, detailed, unimpeachable, her face remained neutral, but her fingers stopped tapping her pen. The atmosphere shifted. Lionel finally took the stand, not as a victim, but as an expert. He laid out every fact with the same clarity he once used to brief entire battalions. No drama, no yelling, just truth. "This isn't about humiliation," he said. "It's about habit. When disrespect becomes routine, abuse is only a step away." Every juror leaned in. Reporters scribbled. And in the gallery, one quiet gasp escaped when Lionel read aloud the words Mallory had spoken to him on that highway. "You people always think you're above the law." That one sentence turned murmurs into outrage. Mallory's attorney tried to object, but it was too late. The damage was done. Keller, called to testify the next day, stuttered through his responses. I was following orders," he said. "He didn't seem dangerous, but..." "But what?" the prosecutor pressed. "I didn't want to escalate," Keller whispered. Too late for that. The courtroom, now fully alert to the stakes, began to realize this wasn't just about one man's mistreatment. It was about a system that allowed it. And now finally someone was fighting back, not with protest, not with fury, but with knowledge, rank, and unimpeachable authority. And that's when the real shift happened, not in the evidence, but in the room itself. Power had changed hands, not through force, but through truth. As the court adjourned for the day, Lionel exited the building flanked by veterans and civil rights attorneys alike. They weren't rallying behind a symbol. They were standing beside a soldier who never stopped serving. After the second hearing, news of General Lionel Hart's case exploded far beyond Alabama. What began as a single incident, a racially charged traffic stop, was quickly evolving into a landmark investigation. Local newspapers started with op-eds, but within days, national outlets picked up the story. Segments on CNN, MSNBC, and even late-night talk shows spotlighted the troubling footage and transcripts from Hart's courtroom testimony. But even more telling than the headlines was what was happening behind the scenes. Major Thomas Reed, Hart's longtime friend and a current Pentagon liaison pushed for a top-down review within the Department of Defense and its cooperation with civilian law enforcement. He called in analysts and former military legal advisors to gather records and identify systemic overlaps where racial profiling had gone unchecked. Within a week, they flagged over 87 complaints related to wrongful stops of military personnel in southern states, 42 of them along rural highways. Back in Alabama, Sheriff I. David Rourke, who had initially dismissed the situation as overblown, was facing pressure from the governor's office. The governor, herself a military mother, issued a statement. "We owe our servicemen and women not just gratitude, but justice. This incident is unacceptable." By this point, both officers Mallory and Keller had been suspended pending an internal review. But the spotlight was widening. Lionel's legal team submitted a public records request for the past 5 years of highway patrol activity logs. The data painted a damning picture. Over 70% of stops initiated by Mallory involved Black or Latino drivers, despite those groups representing less than 30% of the population in the county. In court, Judge Wallace requested to review the complaint history of Mallory and Keller. Though many prior accusations had been quietly dismissed, several bore disturbing similarities to Lionel's experience. Routine stops escalated, civilians detained without probable cause, a pattern of intimidation. It became impossible to ignore. In response, Alabama's Judicial Ethics Committee convened a panel to assess whether department leadership had knowingly allowed these practices to continue. What had been seen as a one-time incident was now unraveling as part of a larger tapestry of abuse and neglect. Lionel, meanwhile, did not shrink from the spotlight. He appeared at universities, churches, and veterans' halls across the South. At one forum hosted by the Southern Legal Defense Center, he read aloud letters he'd received from young soldiers and elderly veterans alike, each one describing nearly identical experiences. One letter from a 19-year-old Army private read, "Sir, I watched your testimony. I didn't know people like you would speak for people like me. I thought I just had to live with it." And Lionel spoke back, every time. "You don't have to live with injustice," he told them. "You have the right to demand better." Major Reed, recognizing Lionel's growing influence, proposed something bold, a joint civilian-military commission to reform police training and accountability. It wouldn't just review protocols, it would rewrite them with input from the very people most often impacted by racial profiling. The idea gained traction. Senator Layton of Georgia publicly backed the plan, stating, "If we want to build trust between communities and the people who police them, we need leaders like General Hart at the helm." Still, not everyone welcomed the change. A coalition of conservative commentators branded Lionel as militant, claiming he was using race as a weapon. But their arguments fell flat. Lionel's demeanor, his decorated history, and his refusal to engage in personal attacks made him unassailable in the public eye. In a televised interview with PBS, Lionel was asked why he didn't just let the issue go. His answer was simple. "Because if I do, then the next time it happens to a young black soldier, they'll think silence is the answer. I'm not interested in punishment. I'm interested in prevention." Meanwhile, Judge Wallace's courtroom continued to draw capacity crowds. Students from nearby law schools came to observe proceedings. Civil rights lawyers submitted amicus briefs supporting Lionel's federal claim under Section 1983, alleging violation of 4th and 14th Amendment rights. The ACLU and NAACP both joined as third-party petitioners. The case had morphed from a local grievance into a national referendum on policing. Then came the revelation that would shake the case to its core. A retired state patrol officer who had served alongside Mallory for 8 years came forward anonymously. Through a statement delivered by his attorney, he claimed that Mallory often boasted about how many people he could get to comply without ever giving cause. He referred to it as the compliance game. Worse, he allegedly kept a personal logbook coded notes about which civilians pushed back, who folded, and how quickly. Though the logbook itself hadn't yet surfaced, the testimony reignited public outrage. In response, Judge Wallace ordered the Highway Patrol to submit all internal records on Mallory's conduct and training evaluations. They complied reluctantly, revealing that Mallory had failed 2 racial sensitivity courses and had been reprimanded twice, once for aggressive behavior during a stop involving a Latino farm worker. Those records had never been disclosed publicly. The deeper the case went, the more Lionel's courage reverberated beyond his own name. Community groups began hosting Know Your Rights workshops. Clergy organized peaceful vigils along Highway 31. A new state bill, the Hart Protection Act, was drafted to mandate body cams for all patrol stops and ban searches without consent in nonviolent incidents. And through it all, Lionel kept attending every court date. Never loud, never angry, just present, just resolute. He told a group of law students one evening, "It's not about proving you're innocent. It's about proving the system doesn't get to decide you're guilty before you open your mouth." For the first time in decades, state prosecutors found themselves under the watchful eyes of a public that had grown tired of apologies and ready for reform. By the end of that month, 12 new internal investigations were launched against Alabama officers, statewide. General Hart's case had lit a fuse, and no one could put it out, because what had begun as a stop on a lonely road was now a movement, a reckoning, a demand for accountability that could no longer be ignored, and it all began with one man who refused to stay quiet. The final phase of Lionel Hart's journey unfolded not in silence, but with deliberate, steady resolve. After weeks of hearings, investigations, and public outcry, Judge Wallace summoned both parties for closing statements. But the hearing that followed wasn't simply about 2 officers. It had transformed into a judgment of the system that created them. General Hart, flanked by Major Reed and 2 civil rights attorneys, entered the courtroom with the same quiet, dignity that had defined his entire campaign for justice. On the opposite bench, Mallory and Keller sat beside their new legal counsel, no longer smug or dismissive, but subdued and visibly shaken. The public seating was packed. Activists, students, journalists, and veterans alike filled every row. Judge Wallace opened the session with calm authority. "We are here to weigh accountability, not only for actions taken, but for the culture that allows misconduct to thrive." Her words set the tone. Hart's attorneys presented a final series of exhibits, a timeline of Mallory's career, internal reviews from the Department of Public Safety, complaint records from minority drivers, body cam footage showing similar stops, all lining up to demonstrate a pattern. Major Reed took the stand, giving testimony about military protocol, civilian police coordination, and how damaging incidents like Hart's erode faith in public institutions. In a pivotal moment, the courtroom fell silent as Lionel Hart himself stood to speak one last time. His voice was composed, unwavering. "I spent 35 years defending this country," he said, "but I was not prepared to be treated like a threat by the very laws I swore to uphold." He continued, "This isn't about ruining reputations. It's about repairing trust, about making sure that the next generation doesn't have to fight this same battle with the same tools." Then came Judge Wallace's ruling. In a measured but powerful statement, she declared that Officers Mallory and Keller had violated both legal standards and public trust. She ordered a formal written apology to General Hart to be published in the local paper and entered into public record. The officer's permanent suspension, pending full review from the State Board of Law Enforcement Standards. Mandatory racial bias and constitutional rights training for the entire patrol unit. An independent civilian oversight committee to be established within 6 months. The courtroom erupted in a rare, solemn applause, not out of celebration, but respect. The judgment resonated as a turning point. Outside, a swarm of reporters waited, General Hart, never one for spectacle, offered a brief statement. Justice isn't a finish line, it's a foundation. Today, we reinforce that foundation, but the work is far from done. In the weeks that followed, Alabama's governor approved a state-level task force on roadside policing reform. Lionel was invited to co-chair the initiative. He accepted on the condition that rural communities be given seats at the table. The people who suffer the most deserve the loudest voice, he said. Reed began working with the Department of Defense to create a nationwide military-civilian incident review protocol, ensuring that service members' rights would be clearly protected in all jurisdictions. Police departments in neighboring counties began revisiting training manuals. In one town, patrols were required to watch Lionel's testimony before receiving new certifications. Debates flared online, in town, halls, and on television. But amid the noise, one thing was clear. A shift had begun. Not because Lionel demanded revenge, but because he insisted on something far more disruptive, change, and it didn't stop in Alabama. Lawmakers in 3 other states introduced legislation modeled after the Hart Accountability Clause, a rider bill enforcing civilian oversight and escalating internal audits in departments with a history of bias complaints. In Montgomery, the Veterans Symposium that Lionel was originally headed to finally reconvened. When he arrived this time, it wasn't to give a talk. It was to receive a citation of honor. And in front of hundreds of service members, he delivered only 5 words. This was never just mine. That line echoed far beyond the auditorium. It appeared in headlines, protest signs, and social media posts. Because Lionel had made the story about something bigger, about the idea that dignity isn't earned by rank or fame, but by standing your ground when others would rather see you disappear. Mallory and Keller would go on to face formal disciplinary hearings. Whether they would return to law enforcement remained uncertain. But for Lionel, the story was never about them. It was about what their actions revealed, and the imperative that followed. Accountability that lasts longer than headlines, because real justice isn't loud, it's lasting. As the dust settled and headlines began to fade from the front pages, the legacy of what had transpired lingered in the air like the final note of a national anthem. Quiet, but unforgettable. General Lionel Hart returned to his home in Arlington, Virginia, a man no longer burdened by humiliation, but propelled by purpose. He wasn't out to be a symbol, but he had become one. In the weeks following Judge Wallace's ruling, Lionel found himself on calls with state officials, civil rights leaders, and young officers who wrote to him anonymously, thanking him for giving them permission to think differently about their uniforms, their roles, and their responsibilities. One letter simply read, "I saw what they did to you. I won't be that kind of cop." It struck Lionel harder than any headline. That this ordeal, painful as it had become a catalyst. He kept the letter, along with a printed copy of the court transcript, tucked into the notebook he'd started that very day on Highway 31, the same one he had kept through every step of the legal process. A record not just of facts, but of fire. Of the moment a line was drawn, not in protest or violence, but in language that law could not ignore. Evelyn, his wife of 33 years, had stayed mostly out of the spotlight, but she watched everything. Every late-night prep session, every call with the governor's office, every young intern who came to seek guidance. One night, as Lionel reviewed a new proposal for a federal task force on patrol conduct, she looked at him and asked, "Do you think this is what your career was leading to?" He paused, then nodded. "I thought the battlefield was behind me. Turns out it just changed shape. What had begun as a single stop on a quiet Alabama road had become a movement." In the following months, 3 neighboring counties adopted mirror policies to the Hart Protocol. Internal Affairs at the state level began auditing departments based on civilian complaint density. A law school at Howard University launched the Hart Fellowship, funding civil rights legal work in rural communities. And perhaps most telling of all, in a private ceremony, General Lionel Hart was honored by the very military whose values he had defended in court, not for his rank, but for his resolve. "We are often taught," the Secretary of the Army said, "that courage is shown on the battlefield. But General Hart reminded us that it's just as necessary when there are no bullets, only silence, and what you choose to say inside it." In the years to come, Lionel and Major Reed would co-author a book titled The Road and the Rule, chronicling not just what happened, but how it changed everything. Lionel didn't retire again, not really. He lectured, he mentored, he showed up, he refused to let the system off the hook. And though Officer Mallory and Officer Keller had long since faded, from public view, one resigned, the other relocated, neither escaped the legacy of their decision. Because every officer who trained in Alabama after that case studied the Hart file. Every academy class watched the footage, not to fear punishment, but to understand consequences. Because at the end of it all, Lionel had proven what no traffic stop, no sneer, no hand on a gun could erase. The law, when wielded with precision and principle, could still protect the dignity it was meant to serve. So if you ever find yourself on a quiet road, questioned for what you look like instead of who you are, remember this story. Not because it's rare, but because it shouldn't be. And remember what Lionel Hart said outside that courthouse when the cameras finally caught up to him. "We didn't win to feel proud. We won so we could keep fighting for those who still can't. Because justice isn't about headlines. It's about legacy. And legacy, in the right hands, never fades." What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one man's rights. It was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong in their own country. General Lionel Hart didn't raise his voice. He raised the bar. And in doing so, he reminded the world that dignity doesn't wear a badge. It stands its ground. If this story made you angry, proud, emotional, or all three, then don't scroll away in silence. Drop a comment. What would you have done? Like if you believe respect should never be optional. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder. The law can serve justice, but only if we demand it. And subscribe because more stories like this are coming, and they matter.